Alexander Hayes, 42 years old and the owner of a fortune valued at $300 million, was having lunch at Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant when a frail-looking girl approached his table. She wore a worn-out dress, her hair was tangled, and her wool jacket had clearly seen better days. Yet her enormous dark eyes made her look like an angel who had fallen from heaven and learned far too early how cruel the world could be. The girl placed her dirty hands on the edge of the white tablecloth and spoke with a calmness that did not belong to someone her age. "Give me whatever is left on your plate, and in return, I'll tell you a secret that will change your life." Alexander was about to call security. Then she leaned toward him and whispered, "I know who killed your wife 2 years ago." The air seemed to vanish from the room. Claire, Alexander's wife, had died in a fire inside their mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. The official investigation concluded that a short circuit had caused the tragedy, but Alexander had never believed that explanation. The electrical system was new, the alarm had never gone off, and Claire was far too careful to ignore any sign of danger. Even so, the police closed the case, and even the most expensive private investigators returned empty-handed. How could a homeless girl know what no one else had managed to uncover? What Lucy would reveal over the next several minutes would not only destroy everything Alexander believed to be true, but would also pull him toward a truth so devastating that someone had tried to bury it forever. The Sterling table, located on the Upper East Side, was considered a sanctuary of New York fine dining. A single dinner there could cost more than many families spent in several weeks. Alexander sat at his usual table, secluded in a corner from which he could observe the entire dining room. In front of him rested a seasonal tasting menu and a cut of Wagyu beef he had barely touched. At his age, he owned nearly everything money could buy. His hotel chain stretched from New York to Los Angeles. His real estate investments were worth hundreds of millions. His face frequently appeared in financial magazines and on lists of the wealthiest businessmen in the country. Yet, as he cut his meat mechanically, his eyes revealed a loneliness he could not hide. 2 years had passed since Claire's death, and the pain remained unchanged. On the night of the fire, Alexander had been in Chicago for a business meeting. Shortly after midnight, someone called to tell him that his house was burning. By the time he arrived, there were only sirens, smoke, blackened walls, and the unbearable certainty that Claire had not made it out. A disturbance near the entrance pulled him from his memories. Charles, the head waiter, was arguing quietly with someone Alexander could not see. The man's voice rose as he insisted that it was a private establishment. A moment later, the girl appeared. She looked about 6 years old. Her flowered dress was faded, and her shoes were too large. She slipped free of Charles's hand and ran straight toward Alexander's table. The other guests stopped talking. No one understood how a homeless child had managed to enter one of Manhattan's most closely guarded restaurants. Alexander stared at her in confusion. Something about her face seemed strangely familiar, although he was certain he had never seen her before. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lucy," she replied firmly. "And you're Alexander Hayes, one of the richest men in New York." He raised an eyebrow. Before he could question her, Lucy proposed the exchange, the leftovers from his plate in return for a secret capable of changing his fate. Alexander assumed it was merely a clever way to ask for food. He almost smiled. Then the girl mentioned Claire and the murder. The silence around the table became deafening. Lucy held his gaze without flinching. There was a maturity in her eyes that unsettled him. "I know everything about the fire," she said. "I know it wasn't an accident, and I know who started it." Alexander could barely form the question. "How could you possibly know that?" Lucy looked at the plate, still half full. "I need to eat first. I haven't had anything in 3 days." Alexander motioned to Charles and asked him to prepare another identical dish immediately. The girl shook her head. I don't want a new one. I want yours. What you have left. It matters. Without understanding why, Alexander pushed his plate toward her. Lucy began to eat with a desperation that was painful to watch. Even so, she did not take her eyes off him for a single second. When she finished, she picked up a linen napkin and carefully wiped her mouth, staining it slightly. Then she spoke in a voice that seemed to belong to someone much older. On the night of the fire, she explained, she had been hiding in a small park across from the Greenwich mansion. She had already been sleeping there for several days. Shortly before the flames appeared, she saw a figure dressed in black enter the property. The person did not force a door. They used a key, entered the correct code, and disabled the alarm as though they knew the house perfectly. Alexander felt the room spin around him. Did you see their face? Lucy nodded slowly. Yes. And when you learn who it was, you'll understand why they tried to kill me too. Every certainty in Alexander's life began to collapse. The girl did not behave like an ordinary child. In her eyes was an intelligence born from fear, loss, and the need to survive. Who tried to hurt you? Lucy glanced nervously around the restaurant before answering. The same people who killed Claire. They know I was there. They know I saw everything. Then Alexander noticed something else. Lucy looked younger than she truly was. When he mentioned it, she admitted that she was not 6 years old, but 9. Hunger and months of living on the street had stunted her growth. The revelation struck him with brutal force. This child had survived alone, hunted, and nearly starving, only because she had become a witness to his wife's murder. Lucy explained that she still could not reveal the name until she was certain she could trust him. Once he learned the truth, he would have to make a choice, make her disappear and pretend the conversation had never happened, or help her seek justice. But if he chose the second option, his own life would be in danger as well. Alexander understood that he was standing before a door that, once crossed, would never allow him to return. Why would they want to kill me? Because the person who murdered Claire is someone you see often. Someone you have allowed into your home, your business, and your life. Someone you trust. Tell me everything. Lucy drew a deep breath. It was Robert Miller. Alexander felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. Robert was not his brother by blood, but he had been his brother in every other way. They had grown up together in Brooklyn, sharing poverty, ambition, and impossible dreams. Years later, they built the hotel empire together. Robert had held Alexander up during the funeral. He had stayed beside him through the darkest nights and sworn that he would help uncover the truth. That's impossible, Alexander murmured. Robert had an alibi. He was at a charity gala that night. The gala ended at 10, Lucy replied. The fire started close to midnight. I saw him arrive. He entered with his own key, disabled the security system, and poured gasoline in different parts of the house. Then he set it on fire. Alexander forced himself to ask why. Lucy explained that Claire had discovered a criminal operation capable of sending Robert to prison for the rest of his life. He was using several hotels to launder money for drug traffickers. Claire had uncovered hidden transfers, shell companies registered in Delaware, accounts linked to intermediaries, and recordings that proved years of betrayal. She had gathered enough evidence to destroy him. Alexander remembered Claire's final weeks. She had been nervous, slept very little, and kept saying that they needed to discuss something important, but that first she had to verify everything. Then Lucy spoke the most difficult truth of all. I know those details because Claire was my mother. Alexander stopped breathing. He looked at the girl with new eyes, and suddenly saw what he should have recognized from the beginning. Lucy's black eyes were identical to Claire's. So were the delicate shape of her face, her nose, and the way she tilted her head while waiting for an answer. That's impossible, he said. The doctor said Claire couldn't have children. Sadness covered Lucy's face. She didn't lie about having trouble becoming a mother again. What she never told you was that she had already had me before she met you. Claire had been 20 years old when she gave birth. For several years, she secretly raised Lucy and told others the girl was her niece. When she began her relationship with Alexander, she became afraid of losing him. He was already a famous businessman, while she was young and had no money. When it came time to marry, Claire believed that revealing the existence of her daughter would destroy everything. Alexander felt his heart break. Claire had chosen him, but that decision had condemned her daughter to grow up far from her mother. Lucy lived with Margaret Bennett, her maternal grandmother, in Queens. Claire visited her in secret and paid all of her expenses. After the fire, Margaret became seriously ill. She died 6 months later, leaving the girl completely alone. While Alexander mourned his wife inside a protected mansion surrounded by luxury, Claire's daughter slept on benches, in train stations, and in abandoned buildings. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Because Robert was looking for me." On the night of the fire, after setting the house ablaze, Robert had noticed a small silhouette among the trees in the park. He realized there was a witness and hired men to find her. Lucy spent months moving from one shelter to another, hiding and learning how to recognize the people who were following her. Then she reached beneath her jacket and pulled out a small USB drive. "Everything is here. The accounts, the transfers, the recordings, and Robert's conversations with the traffickers. Mom gave it to me the morning before she died. She told me to hide it and not trust anyone." Alexander took the device with trembling hands. Inside that tiny object rested Claire's innocence, Robert's guilt, and perhaps the possibility of justice. "Why didn't you take it to the police?" Lucy looked at him bitterly. "Who would have believed me? I was a homeless child accusing one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. Robert has connections in courts, police stations, and government offices. If I gave the drive to the wrong person, I wouldn't have survived a single day." The girl then stated her final condition. Alexander could use the evidence, destroy Robert, and avenge Claire. But if he did, he would also have to protect her. She had no one left. Alexander looked at the small girl who had risked her life to preserve the only evidence capable of clearing her mother's name. Lucy was Claire's daughter, and from that moment on, she became the most important person in his world. "You will never be alone again," he promised. For the first time since entering the restaurant, Lucy smiled. In that smile, Alexander saw Claire alive again. But there was still one more revelation. "Robert is planning to kill you," Lucy said. "He knows you kept investigating the fire, and he thinks you're too close to the truth. Next week, during the Friday meeting with the investors, he plans to stage an accident." Alexander realized that every one of his movements had been watched. His searches, his questions to detectives, and his business activities had probably been reported to Robert. The man he called his brother had betrayed him long before Alexander suspected anything. Lucy had been watching Robert for months. She had listened to several phone calls, followed vehicles, memorized schedules, and witnessed secret meetings. That 9-year-old girl had gathered more information than every professional Alexander had hired. The time had come for Robert Miller to pay for what he had done to Claire, to Lucy, and to him. During the 3 days after their meeting at the Sterling table, Alexander completely transformed his routine. He placed Lucy in a private suite at one of his hotels under a temporary identity and assigned discreet bodyguards to protect her 24 hours a day. The girl proved to be an extraordinary source of information. She had not only witnessed Claire's murder, over months of surveillance, she had also assembled a detailed file on Robert's crimes. In only 3 days, Lucy herself began to change. After bathing and receiving clean clothes, Her brown hair regained the same highlights Alexander remembered in Claire's. Her eyes shone with an intelligence that was even more obvious now that hunger and fear were no longer consuming her. She remained thin and distrustful, but for the first time, she slept under a roof without fearing that someone would find her. Together, they designed a plan. Lucy knew the date and location of the meeting, the method Robert intended to use to kill Alexander, and even the building's blueprints. During the previous weeks, she had discovered maintenance shafts and secondary access points that would allow her to move unseen. Alexander purchased the most advanced recording equipment available, small enough to be hidden inside a button. He also hired a team of former federal agents. He no longer fully trusted the local police or the lawyers connected to the company. The plan seemed simple, but in practice it was dangerous. Alexander would act as though he knew nothing. He had to appear calm, continue his normal meetings, and allow Robert to believe he was still in control. Once he felt safe, he would probably talk. Men like him often confuse victory with immunity, and in doing so, ended up bragging about their crimes. Lucy would remain hidden near the office, recording every word. If anything went wrong, she would activate an emergency button connected to the security team. On the night of the meeting, Alexander entered One Vanderbilt with his heart pounding against his chest. He knew Robert had planned his death, but he also knew Lucy was nearby, protected and ready to capture the truth. Robert greeted him with the same warm smile he always wore. He spoke enthusiastically about a group of investors from California interested in financing a massive hotel resort in Palm Beach. For the first hour, everything appeared normal. The numbers were impressive, the presentations were flawlessly prepared, and the guests asked reasonable questions. Yet Alexander noticed that Robert kept checking the time. At 10:30, Robert stood up and pretended to receive an urgent phone call. Then he asked Alexander to follow him to his private office. Alexander followed, knowing that this was the moment they had been waiting for. Robert closed the door. The friendliness vanished from his face. He opened a drawer, pulled out a gun, and aimed it directly at Alexander's chest. What followed went beyond even Alexander's worst suspicions. Convinced that he was about to eliminate the only man capable of confronting him, Robert confessed everything. He spoke about the millions laundered through the hotels, his connections to criminal organizations, and the jealousy he had accumulated over the years. He had always hated that Alexander received the recognition, power, and respect while he remained in the shadows. Then, he described Claire's murder with monstrous coldness. He admitted that he had entered the mansion using his own key, disabled the alarm, and spread fuel in carefully selected areas so the fire would appear to have started from an electrical failure. Claire had discovered him and refused to remain silent. Robert decided to kill her before she could hand over the evidence. He also mentioned the witness, a miserable little girl hiding in the park whom his men had been unsuccessfully hunting for months. "I never imagined a creature like that could cause me so much trouble," he said with contempt. Robert raised the weapon. Alexander looked at him without backing away. "Her name is Lucy." Robert's face twisted. The surprise was so intense that, for a second, he lowered the gun slightly. At that moment, the door opened. Lucy entered with her head held high, carrying a small recorder. Behind her came 3 plainclothes agents. Robert swung the gun toward the girl, but Alexander reacted first. He lunged at him and knocked his arm aside. The agents brought Robert to the floor, secured the weapon, and placed him in handcuffs while he shouted threats and insults. As he was taken out of the office, Robert warned that his criminal partners would come after them. Alexander did not even answer. For the first time in 2 years, he felt that Claire could finally begin to rest in peace. 6 months later, Alexander sat in a federal courtroom in Manhattan to hear the sentence. Lucy sat beside him, elegant in a dark blue dress he had bought for the occasion. The girl held his hand tightly, as they waited for the justice they had pursued for so long. The trial became a national event. The recordings obtained by Lucy were impossible to refute. The USB drive allowed investigators to reconstruct years of money laundering, bribery, and illegal operations. The investigation uncovered a corruption network far larger than anyone had imagined. Robert Miller was charged with premeditated murder, laundering money derived from drug trafficking, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Throughout the weeks of the trial, Lucy displayed extraordinary strength. She testified clearly, answered every question without contradicting herself, and described what had happened with a calmness that moved the jury. Alexander watched her with pride. The starving child, who had appeared at his table, had become a courageous witness determined to defend her mother's memory. Alexander's life had changed completely as well. Lucy now lived with him in the restored Greenwich mansion. Discovering that, in some unexpected way, he had become a father was the most beautiful transformation of his life. The girl was intelligent, curious, and possessed a resilience that continued to astonish everyone. One of the rooms in the house was turned into her bedroom. Lucy decorated it with books, drawings, and the photographs of Claire she had protected during her months on the street. Every night before bed, she told Alexander stories about her mother that he had never heard. How Claire sang while cooking, how she saved old letters, and how she dreamed of one day bringing together the two people she loved most. The judge began reading the verdict in a solemn voice. Guilty of premeditated murder. Guilty of laundering tens of millions of dollars. Guilty of attempted murder. The final sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lucy squeezed Alexander's hand even more tightly. Neither of them felt joy. The sentence could not bring Claire back or erase the years of fear. It only gave them the quiet sense that, at last, the truth had prevailed. Robert Miller would pay for his crimes for the rest of his life. When Alexander and Lucy left the courthouse, they were surrounded by cameras and reporters. Their story had moved the entire country. A millionaire who discovered the existence of his late wife's daughter, and a girl who, despite living on the street, had preserved the evidence needed to solve a murder. But the attention of the press meant little to them. What mattered was that they could now live without hiding, sleep without fear, and know that Claire had received justice. That afternoon, in the peace of the mansion, Alexander watched Lucy play in the garden with Luna, the golden retriever he had given her. The girl laughed while the dog chased a ball. To Alexander, that laughter was the most beautiful sound he had heard in many years. Later, Lucy expressed a special wish. She wanted to carry the last name Hayes. She no longer wanted a name that made her feel separate. She wanted the world to know that they were now a family. Alexander immediately began the legal adoption process. They also made another important decision. Alexander would dedicate half of his fortune to creating a foundation for homeless children. The organization would bear Claire Bennett's name and would provide shelter, education, psychological support, and legal assistance to abandoned minors. Lucy loved the idea and insisted that she be allowed to help manage it when she grew older. She said it was the best way to honor her mother and prevent other children from suffering as she had. 1 year after their first meeting, Alexander and Lucy often returned to the Sterling table. Charles always welcomed them with a smile. He still found it difficult to believe the transformation in the man who had once eaten alone, silent, and consumed by grief. Now Alexander laughed, while Lucy told him about her adventures at school. The girl attended an excellent school in New York. Before long, she distinguished herself as a brilliant student, especially talented in science and languages. She regained weight, grew several inches, and learned to trust again. Alexander discovered that being a father was the most natural and rewarding responsibility he had ever taken on. Lucy brought joy back into his life, taught him to look beyond business, and reminded him that a life filled with property could still be empty if there was no love inside it. Every night, when he walked her to her room, he watched Lucy read or draw beneath the photographs of Claire. The girl insisted that they remain visible. "I want Mom to see how happy we are," she explained. One night, as Alexander tucked the blanket around her, Lucy asked a question that filled his heart. "Can I call you Dad?" Alexander's eyes filled with tears. "Nothing in this world could make me happier." From then on, Lucy called him Dad, and he never grew tired of hearing that word spoken with such love. The following month, the adoption was officially approved. During the ceremony, as the judge spoke the words that legally made them father and daughter, Alexander felt Claire's presence more strongly than ever. Lucy brought a photograph of her mother and asked that it remain on the table. "She should be here too," she said. "This moment belongs to her as well." The judge, who knew their story from the newspapers, allowed the photograph to remain throughout the entire ceremony. The Claire Bennett Foundation for the Protection of Children began operating soon afterward. During its first year, it helped hundreds of homeless minors. Lucy took part in events and, when she felt ready, told her story to encourage other children not to lose hope. At one of those gatherings, she said something everyone would remember. "Sometimes families become separated, but if you never stop believing in love, they always find a way to come back together." Alexander often thought about those words. He had lost Claire, but he had found Lucy. He had lost the man he considered a brother, but he had gained a daughter who filled his life with purpose. One evening, as they ate dinner on the mansion's terrace overlooking the hills of the Hudson Valley, Alexander looked at the extraordinary girl who had changed his entire existence. Lucy lifted her eyes from her plate and smiled. In that expression, Alexander saw Claire again. He saw love, hope, and the future he had always wanted without even realizing it. The girl who had entered a restaurant offering a secret in exchange for leftovers had given him far more than he could ever have imagined. She gave him back a family, happiness, and the certainty that true love never disappears. It changes, endures, and sooner or later finds its way home. Charles had been right when he said no one would have believed that a single child could change a man's life so completely. But Lucy was not just a child. She was the daughter who had returned home, carrying her mother's memory and the promise of a future filled with love. As they watched the sunset over the hills together, Alexander felt that Claire was smiling somewhere, happy to see her family finally reunited. As Lucy often said, love always finds its way back home. Leave a like if you believe true love can overcome any obstacle. Write in the comments which moment of this story moved you the most. Share this story to inspire those who still believe in justice, family, and second chances. Subscribe to discover more stories about hidden truths, unexpected destinies, and people who found the courage to begin again.